What's up everybody, how's it going? In this video, we're going to cover everything that you need to know about front-end engineering. What it is exactly, how hard it is, and whether or not you should do it. So sit back, relax, be on the lookout for when you're going to want to smash the like button in this video, and let's dive into it. One thing to clarify here, when I talk about front-end engineering, I'm specifically referring to web development, or the type of engineering that uses the same tech stack that you would use in web development, like JavaScript, CSS, HTML. So I'm not necessarily referring to mobile development using Swift or Objective-C, for instance. Web development. Okay, so let's start by looking at what front-end engineering really is, because there are a lot of misconceptions about it out there, especially if you ask back-end engineers or engineers who've never worked on the front end. They tend to butcher it or to tell you things that aren't super accurate, so I will give you a clearer picture of it. I like to define front-end engineering by splitting it up into 4 broad categories of work that you're likely going to do at one point in your life if you're a front-end engineer. Keep in mind, these are broad categories, so I might not be capturing every single piece of front-end engineering work that exists out there, but hopefully these categories are broad enough such that they can encapsulate everything. The first category is styling. CSS, the thing that we all know and hate. Okay, maybe I'm the only one who hates it. I can't be the only one who hates it. CSS styling is admittedly a large part of front-end engineering. Now here's where things get interesting though, and this is where I've very much surprised a lot of people in the past when I've told them that when I was a front-end engineer at Google, I was effectively a front-end engineer because I worked purely on the front end for my 2 years and 2 months there, I never wrote a single line of CSS during those 2 years. Or maybe I wrote like 5 lines at most. How is that possible? I bet a lot of you in the comments are going to be very surprised. It's possible because depending on the type of project that you're working on, you may not need to write CSS. The reason I didn't write CSS at Google is because I worked on the Google Cloud Platform UI, and if you've ever seen the Google Cloud Platform UI, specifically the Google Cloud Platform console, you've likely noticed that the UIs for all of the different Google Cloud Platform products look very, very similar. And that's done on purpose because Google wants the Google Cloud Platform to be very homogeneous and to look like it's basically a single suite of products, not a bunch of products that happen to be on the same platform. And so they want everything to look the same. They want all the buttons, all the tables, all the lists, all the drop-down menus, everything to look the same, to look very cohesive. And so what that meant was that as a front-end engineer, I wasn't actually responsible for styling any of the stuff that I was putting on the page. I was given these pre-made puzzle pieces, so to speak, that I just had to put together and wire up, add some logic into them to make them perform. Now, of course, this is in stark contrast with the type of front-end engineering work that we do on AlgoExpert, for example. By the way, if you're preparing for your coding interviews or your systems design interviews, check out algoexpert.io, my company. Use the promo code CLEM, C-L-E-M, for a discount on the platform. But so on AlgoExpert, since we created the entire website from scratch, we weren't given these pre-made puzzle pieces, we had to do a lot of styling. We had to do the entire styling on the website. So we wrote, and we continue to write, a lot of CSS on AlgoExpert. And by the way, there are a lot of different levels or degrees of CSS. This applies to all aspects of software engineering, but particularly so to CSS. You can do basic styling, the kind of styling that you need to have a proper presentable website, and that's just normal CSS. But then you can do a lot more advanced CSS if you want really cool little animations or pieces of artwork on a website. So for instance here, I'll point to Systems Expert. We've got a few really cool animations on the Systems Expert homepage, and I'm not going to take credit for them. It's the other person who's working on the front end who did that. But the point is, they involve a lot more complex CSS. They're the types of projects that take a lot more time. You typically will treat them as their own little featurettes, and that's just a next level of CSS above just normal website styling. The second type of front-end work is going to be what I like to call layout. This is really going to be just HTML, putting elements on a page. This is going to get a little bit more complicated once you start to work with front-end frameworks like Angular or React, because your templating, your HTML, is just going to be a little bit more complex. There might be a little bit of framework-specific stuff that you're going to add to it. But the point is, layout is a very core part of front-end work. Contrary to CSS, I would say that no matter what you work on, you're going to have to do some bit of layout, because at the end of the day, with front-end engineering work, you are putting stuff on a page. So it's very rare that you would do front-end work with absolutely no layout, no HTML. But the way that I like to think about layout is it's really just the glue that puts everything together in front-end engineering. Then the third category of work in front-end engineering is what I like to call state management. And this is where things start to get very tricky. This is something that I think a lot of people who haven't worked on the front end might not think about when they think of the front end. State management is basically the way that you manage state in your application. If you're not familiar with state, if you think of a web application, at any given point in time, that web application is in a particular state. For example, maybe a drop-down menu is open. Maybe a credit card is written in a purchase form. Maybe a question on AlgoExpert is marked as complete. That is the state of the application, and you need to manage that state. How do you manage it? By writing JavaScript, by using frameworks like React and Angular. This is where you can actually start to show off your skills as a front-end engineering by writing good code, modular components, sensible state management. This is where things start to get much more complicated. And this is something that, like I said, a lot of people either aren't aware of or they take for granted. For example, take a website like AlgoExpert. In the top right corner, we have the little login text. And if you're logged in, it says welcome and your username. This is the kind of thing where a backend engineer or someone who's never worked on the front end might assume that because they see the username of the user in the top right corner of the screen there, that anywhere on the page, you should have access to the username. You know, they might think that, oh, that username's up there, so if we wanted to, we could display the username also somewhere lower in the page. Not necessarily. Depending on how you've designed your application, you might not have access to that particular part of the state, meaning the username, elsewhere in your application, if that makes sense. If you've worked on the front end, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm hinting at stuff like Redux, for instance. But if you've never worked on the front end, this might be very confusing to you. You might take this for granted, think, wait, what do you mean? You have the username, it's up there. Why can't you display it lower on the page? Well, because of state management. And then finally, the fourth part of front-end engineering is what I'm going to call dealing with asynchronicity. When you're writing a web application, you are almost certainly going to be interacting with a backend, with an API. You're going to be making network requests. These network requests are going to be asynchronous, meaning you're not going to get the responses from these requests instantly, and you're going to have to deal with that. That can go from being very trivial, you just make one network request, you get a response, and you do something with it, to very complex, because maybe you're going to be chaining 5 different network requests. Maybe you're going to have to handle a bunch of different potential responses, a bunch of different errors. Maybe you're going to have to do some state management within those responses to these asynchronous actions. The point is, dealing with asynchronicity in JavaScript and in front-end engineering is pervasive. You're going to have to do it, and it can get very tricky, it can get very complex, and it's also very fun. This is the part of front-end engineering that I enjoy the most. But so that's front-end engineering in a nutshell. I would say that most engineers who work on the front end are going to have to work in all 4 of these categories, or at least they're going to have to be well-versed in these 4 categories. But depending on your situation, you may work a little bit more in one category or the other. For instance, like I said, I just didn't do any styling when I was a front-end engineer at Google because of the product that I worked on. It's possible that you might do the opposite as a front-end engineer. Maybe you're going to be working on a project where you're focusing most of your attention on CSS, on styling, on making really cool animations, maybe going to those really high levels of CSS, and less so on the asynchronous aspect of front-end engineering or on the state management aspect. And of course, if you're dealing with a very static website that doesn't really deal with an API, then you're going to have a lot less of that other stuff. Now, how hard is front-end engineering? I would say that it's relatively hard. Obviously, the more you practice it, the more you do it, the easier it gets. But I would say that it tends to be underestimated, or when people say that it's very difficult, they might think it's difficult for the wrong reasons. For instance, I think that now it's very common to hear people, especially back-end engineers, say things like, oh yes, the front end is very hard, so they'll concede that the front end is very hard. They'll even say stuff like front end engineering is more difficult than back end engineering, but then they'll justify it by saying because it involves a lot of like art or UX design because you're styling stuff. And I think that that's misguided, that's misinformed. That assumes that as a front-end engineering, not only are you gonna be doing styling, but that you might even be the person deciding on what a website looks like, which again might be true if you're working on your own business like us on Algo Expert, where we come up with the UX design. But if you're at a big company like Google, you're certainly not going to be coming up with the UX design as a front-end engineer. So I think that that's an incorrect reason for which front-end engineering would be deemed hard. What I think is more accurate is that front-end engineering is deceptively simple. A UI looks easy to build, but it can actually be very tricky to build behind the scenes. The canonical example is the saying, I don't know if it's a real saying, but you often hear people say it, which is that, oh, it's just a checkbox. You know, you have a feature on the UI that's a checkbox, and someone will say, oh yeah, that's just a checkbox, or you haven't implemented that feature yet, and they'll be like, don't worry, it's just a checkbox, but it turns out it's not just a checkbox, it's actually really complicated. We had a perfect example of this at Google a few months before I left. We had this feature that our backend team had been working on, and they told us on the front end, they were like, oh, don't worry about it, this will have very little UI ramification, it's just gonna be a checkbox. Literally, they said that, it's just gonna be a checkbox. We were, cautiously giving them the benefit of the doubt, but then it turned out that that checkbox had so much logic behind it, because checking off that checkbox had you issue some API calls, but in order to issue those API calls, you had to have like 3 different permissions, so we had to check if the user had permission to check the checkbox. How do you check for permissions? You make API calls, so we had to do like 3 different API calls, but then for some of these API calls, there were prerequisite permissions that you needed, so we needed other API calls. This complicated a bunch of stuff. Then there was error handling, state management. Oh, but wait, you need access to this piece of information here, but we're not in the same part of the UI where we typically have access to that information. Point is, it wasn't just a checkbox. It's never just a checkbox. Front-end engineering is pretty hard, and that's that. But then on a final note, as far as whether or not you should work on the front end, I would really say that it's a matter of personal preference. I personally love front-end engineering, even though I always like to joke that I hate CSS or that I dislike CSS. Even CSS can be fun. I think that the package of those 4 categories of work that I described is very rewarding, it's very challenging, it's a good mixture of different types of skills. And what I love the most about front-end engineering work is that you can really see visually the outcome of your work. I'll give the example of Algo Expert, putting aside the fact that with Algo Expert we're actually building our own business, but it was so rewarding, and it continues to be so rewarding, to see all this work that you put into the code suddenly turn into a website that people can actually interact with, that has functionality, that looks really good, and so on and so forth. So that's why I love front-end engineering. That's why I think a lot of people love front-end engineering. That's why I think you might love front-end engineering if you're not already into it. Let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. Do it now if you haven't already. You know you want to. Smash the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.